any day, and he will tell you Vietnam may destroy anybody who touches it, and we may not be excluded. There's a fatalism involved. So I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. Yes? Well, the question.
Well, the question.
The question is how do we?
Is to get to know China, to bring her in.
No, I don't think so. I think once again that political necessity makes strange bedfellows, you know, and I think that even though it's like we've ripped out 20 years of our history here and we're starting over, that I think it's very possible. I think it's to China's interest, and I think it's to our interest, and I think it's just long and tough. But I think it can be done, and I think they want it. You know, I just think the nature of people, I think the people aren't mad at each other, it's just the leaders. And I think it's entirely possible. Now, there are great hazards along the way. For instance, nobody knows what happens when Mao dies. Mao is 78, Zhou is 73. The leaders of China, the effective leaders to this day, are terribly old. And when they all go, we don't know what happens. Now, the problem is, and the worry about our people in the State Department is that we'll have to go back and do it all over again. As you know, Lin Piao, who was defense minister, has disappeared. And when we would ask the Chinese what happened to Lin Piao, they would say, "Eat your duck," or something like that. They never answered it. Never answered it. And the theory that the CIA has is that he was shot, that he wanted to realign with Russia and go on the ideological line of communism, wanted to be friends with the other communist countries and declare against us and increase the tension between the United States and China. And the word is that he lost, and Mao and Zhou feared Russia more, and they wanted to realign with the United States. And therefore Lin Piao lost, fled, was shot, killed, all of that. Now, what happens when Mao dies and these people go? Will there be another convulsion? Will there be more fighting? Will somebody come out on top who doesn't like the United States and we have to go through the whole thing again? It's a hazardous journey, and we don't know the end of it. But I think it's possible. So therefore, I endorse Mr. Nixon's journey and hope that there are others, that we keep going. Yes? Oh, yes. The question was, were we able to talk to the Chinese about Russia? Indeed, they talked to us about Russia. This was on their mind constantly. They reminded us of all of the problems with Russia. They reminded us of those 1 million troops on the northwest frontier. They constantly talked about the report of 3 years ago, which is true as far as we know, where Russia actively considered a nuclear strike against China to wipe out her nuclear capability at that time, rather than waiting for trouble. They talked about all this, and they kept re-emphasizing. That was one thing they did talk to us very much about. One of the fellows, Joseph Kraft, went up for an evening with the Soviet embassy, which is almost in a state of siege now. These unhappy Russians are surrounded out there in this rather grubby place. And he said, "Welcome to the fortress," you know, and that was about it. So there is great fear of Russia. There is great resentment, kind of build up. And I suspect that the whole Nixon visit and the rapprochement with the United States is based on this. And we'll see what happens. Yes, sir. What evidence is there of wealth? There's very little. No, there isn't much. There are no classes in China. You see, this is something very different. This is why this summit was incredibly different than any other. There's no class structure. There are no rich people in China. There are varying wages, but they're very minor. There isn't much difference in what people get. Zhou Enlai lives modestly. So does Mao Zedong. Modest house. There's none of the panoply that accompanies the office like you have in the communist countries, in Russia, in Eastern Europe. You don't have a class structure as you do now in Russia, emerging, which they're very wealthy, privileged people. There is none of that. There is no sign of wealth any place. Public buildings are the most ostentatious, and they're rather grim, most of them. Just plain. But nobody does that. Zhou Enlai, we went down to Hanqiao, and they gave Nixon the cottage, the Imperial Cottage, or whatever it's called. It's Zhou's and Mao's place, and they said, this is our favorite. Zhou Enlai said he hadn't been there for 6 years. Mr. Nixon goes to San Clemente or wherever it is every other week. You see, it's this type of existence, really a classless society. And we saw no evidence of wealth except in military matters or public buildings. Then they put the money in, but there's no opulence, really. There's no great luxury any place that we saw. There are some marble floors in the Great Hall. That's about it. But it wasn't evident at all. It's a poor country, very, very poor country still by all our standards. Yes. Did the Chinese discuss their internal disorders in the Cultural Revolution? They would in a limited capacity. They would talk about the fact that they went out to a farm and worked for a year, or they were taken such and such and worked for a year, or they're going to do it. And they talked about why it was. And they also talked about the mistakes, that it had gone too far. They were willing to talk about that. But they wouldn't discuss the slaughter, which we know happened, in which very talented people were killed and all of that. They wouldn't go into it that far. They wouldn't embarrass their country that much. There was a curious, again, contrast in which they were willing to admit error. Now, you can't find that with another communist from Russia or Eastern Europe. They will never admit they're in error. They always rationalize every movement and everything and every discussion, and they will never ever say we're wrong. The Chinese would. We asked one fellow at our table who was talking rather liberally, not that much, but we said, will you get in trouble by talking with us? He said, no. He said, I may make a mistake. If I say something that's embarrassing, he said, and it gets back, he said, we'll have a discussion. I will learn from that mistake and I won't do it again. We asked about other violations of law, traffic violations and that. What about your courts? What happened to criminals? They said, we take them down, we counsel with them, the neighborhood committees talk to them, and generally we convince them of the error of their ways. And we said, but what happens if they don't? If they don't convince them, they said, we take care of them. Whatever that is. Yes. Oh, yes. The question was that I thought we had made a mistake in our policy towards Red China over the last 22 years. And does Mr. Nixon agree? Yes, he does. I think that deep down, I doubt that he'll ever confess that in a public broadcast from Madison Square Garden or anything like that. I wouldn't look for that. As a matter of fact, I suspect that he will rationalize to himself why it was necessary in the political climate of the United States during these years to be as he was. But I think deep down, and Dr. Kissinger suggests this, deep down we have learned that it really, it just was terribly unwise. As a matter of fact, if you'll read the literature, it's rather interesting. It's like, as I say, we took a chapter of our book, 22 years, and just ripped it out and started over. If you read Stilwell, about Stilwell, the new Tuckman book, Stilwell in China, if you read John Service, and all of these fellows that were over there that time, that were discredited by Joe McCarthy afterwards, you'll discover that what they were saying in 1948, 49 was exactly what Nixon is saying now. And it's almost as if we just start there and start over again. And we're accepting this doctrine now that their communism is not like the communism of Russia, that their outlook, their future is not going to be like the traditional imperialistic expansionary idea of traditional Marxism. So that, yes, without any question that Mr. Nixon, as he looks back, says, look, perhaps this wasn't wrong in a political sense, but in a real sense it was wrong. Yes, I think he feels that. No, I don't know. The question is about Mr. Service and those people that were so discredited and their lives ruined by that period. No, nothing is said in there. There's no effort at restitution or anything. I think that's just an embarrassing episode that probably is just forgotten, covered over, and we go on now. But he doesn't say anything about it. Dr. Kissinger talks about it a little, but not that much. Yes? Talk about the equality and the pay with the workers. I don't know that much about it. We had an awful time. We'd ask what they made, and they'd never tell us, you know. But they would say there would be a difference on the commune, for instance. I wanted to know what their wages were, you know, what the difference was. And we never got an answer that was satisfactory. We'd just say that there was a different level of wages. The man who managed the commune made a little more than the man who spread the manure, and he may have made a little more than the man who gathered the eggs or whatever it was, but we never got an absolute figure of what it was. I don't know to this day, really, what the wages are. There are experts who know that. It is around. I mean, the information is available. But we just never got an explanation about it. Difference between men and women, the role, hardly any. I mean, the women all wore pants and never saw a skirt while I was there. Most of them worked. The children were cared for in the day center. The men, frequently on the streets, were caring for the little children that I saw. Zhou Enlai commented to Mr. Nixon that his interpreter, what was it, Nancy Ling or something like that, Nancy Tang, I guess, that while she was interpreting for Mr. Nixon, the husband was home keeping the children, and that there was no differentiation. And I think that's quite true. Odd thing about sex, you know, this was a peculiar thing about it. Boys and girls not with each other. We went to the badminton tournaments and the ping pong tournaments and the gymnasts, and here was this incredible stadium, I suppose like your Coliseum, 18,000 people there, every seat filled, nobody going to the men's room or the ladies' room, nobody slouching, everybody sitting there clapping on cue like a machine, you know. And then when it was over, I sat in a bus and I thought it was like the end of a football game, and they poured out into the night. Young people they were. And there were the girls went with the girls and the boys went with the boys. And there'd be 2 boys together, 2 girls over here, 4 boys. So I inquired about this. I said, what is this? What's the romantic quotient here in China? And they said there really is none. That Mao has advocated quite successfully virginity till age 26 for women, and apparently for men too. And he said it is generally the case, and there is no courting really as we know it. It is a matter of fact that they meet in school or they meet on the job, and then they get married, and that's it. And you just don't have that relationship. And the women do work, all of it, interpret. Some of the women were more clever as interpreters, were the best ones we had, as a matter of fact. And you see the women in the streets on that morning when 200,000 people poured out to clean the snow off in front of our hotel. There were just as many women as there were men. As a matter of fact, that's another observation of mine. I'd expected a little Madison Avenue hustle in China. I'd heard about the great outpouring of energy. It was a WPA atmosphere. A lot of these people leaning on their shovels out in the street, kind of horsing around, you know. When we were on the commune out behind the haystack or whatever it is they have over there, a few guys standing around, you know, like I remembered it in Iowa. You know, everybody had a place, but it wasn't that energetic. It wasn't that. It was at their own pace, that sort of thing. Yes. The question is, if I were asked to evaluate Mao as a philosopher and political leader, what would I say about him? He may be the greatest one in the world today. The kids may have a point for the wrong reasons. You know, I don't like the lack of freedom. I'm against that. But there are those who believe that Mao understood the great problem of China, that here were 800 million people utterly unable to unite in any way, cast in the old Middle Kingdom idea that what they needed to bring them together was a godlike figure who became Mao, and that having brought them together under that philosophy, that Mao fully realizes that when he finally gets them into the modern world in whatever way he can, that he will be cast aside, that people will understand after they join the modern world that this is not the answer. So I don't know. He may be the most brilliant man we've seen. It's rather curious to see how Dr. Kissinger is taken with these Chinese. Now, Kissinger's dealt with virtually all of the people around the world now. And he hates the Russians, the Eastern Europeans. He rather likes the French. He's not that fond of the British. The Japanese drive him wild. The U.S. Congress he can't stand. But he is taken with the Chinese. And he is taken with them because they approach diplomacy as philosophers. Because they stop and they discuss these little things, and they have a sense of literature and a sense of poetry. They have a sense of history and a sense of place, kind of. So he's ready to admit that they're the best, really. They're the most interesting, the most skillful people to deal with that he's yet dealt with. So it's conceivable that Mao is. He just may be the most skillful philosopher, politician that we have around today. We'll have to wait to see. It may be a long time. But it's interesting to contemplate anyway. So you hear that question? Would I give a little analysis of my close friend Spiro, what his relationship with Mr. Nixon is, and will he be around after Los Angeles or San Diego or Miami or wherever they're going to meet, if they meet? Well, not close. It isn't a close relationship. Mr. Nixon will tell you that if you ever talked with him. Mr. Agnew will tell you. It's rather cool, distant. It is a professional business relationship. I suspect Mr. Nixon holds his counsel from Mr. Agnew a great deal, like he does from all of us. Agnew on certain occasions has even said publicly in kind of disgust that he doesn't know where he stands with the president. He is really unaware of whether he will be asked to be vice president again or not. I think it boils down to mathematics, pure and simple. If indeed we come into this period next, say, early August, and Mr. Nixon is in trouble, Vietnam has gone sour, the economy is bad, ITT has discovered that we've discovered Mr. Nixon has a chunk of ITT or something like that. And his fortunes are low, he's running down in the polls. And the Democrats, for some reason that we can't foresee now, have found a man, and that he is nominated, and he's articulate and can talk. And if we're confronted with that, and Mr. Nixon is in a kind of a desperate situation, and say, Mr. Wallace, it appears that he'll hurt Mr. Nixon in the South worse than he'll hurt the Democrat. And Mr. Nixon is in trouble in the cities, with the students, with the blacks, other minorities, with the Farm Belt. Then I think you look at your vice presidential nominee. Now, the old tradition has it that a vice president can't help you, but that he can hurt you. And if the polls come in, as they did last summer on Mr. Agnew, and it says that 85% of the students on the campus don't like him, and 90-some% of the blacks don't like him, and the Northeast doesn't like him, and Chicago doesn't like him, and even the South can barely stand him, then I think, according to a prearranged and probably signed, sealed, delivered document that is even now in Mr. Agnew's or Mr. Nixon's safe, that Mr. Agnew will march into the Oval Office one morning and he will say, Dick, or whatever he calls him, Mr. President, I guess, he will say, I must get out of this job. And Mr. Nixon will say, you can't do it, Spiro. I need you. I've got to have you. And Mr. Agnew will say, no, it's just I've got to make money. I'm going to contribute to your defeat. I've got to leave. And there will be a suitable scene fully recorded on living color television and broadcast to 60 million people of Agnew over Mr. Nixon's great protest leaving the job. And then he will turn to John Connally. I say there's a good chance of that. Yes, indeed. I say the elections are going to be a good deal closer than we now envision. It always is. When you get a real live candidate against a president and they have to face the issues together, I think it'll narrow down. Yes. What's the influence of Dr. Kissinger on the president? That's fascinating. That's the best book that's ever going to be written out of this administration if somebody does it. And I hope Dr. Kissinger does it. I hope someplace he records it if indeed Mr. Nixon has a long, prosperous life, which I hope he does. I hope Dr. Kissinger puts it down on tape so we can have it when they're both dead, because it is the most fascinating thing. Now, there are those within the White House, people of intelligence, those who have left that I've talked to, and they claim, those who will talk are the only ones that will talk, those who have left. But they claim that it has now come down in their judgment to where Dr. Kissinger is the instructor and Mr. Nixon is the student. And they say that Mr. Nixon went into the White House fancying himself a great foreign policy expert, and he was by all standards. When you compare him to Jim Eastland and Alan Ellender and these 90 feet of movies and those other great foreign policy experts, he is. And that Mr. Nixon so fancied himself, but when he ran into the full force of Henry Kissinger's intellect and the depth of his knowledge, which is formidable, let me tell you, he's the single most impressive White House aide I've ever seen around there. When he ran into that, Nixon suddenly realized that this was something else. And there was a subtle and slow but perceptible change, and that Dr. Kissinger has more to say about our foreign policy than Mr. Nixon at this point. Not really, because Nixon holds the power, but I mean in getting the concepts about it. One of the Harvard professors that knows Kissinger very well says it's like Aristotle and Philip of Macedon. Now, you history people know about that. I don't. That left me cold. Somebody said Aristotle committed suicide and Philip lost his power later on. But anyway, one fellow said, this is it. A very brilliant man hooked up with a very powerful man. The powerful man wise enough to know that he's found somebody who knows more than he does, and he listens to him. But it is a singular, most interesting relationship in Washington that I've seen for a long, long time. And I wish I knew it. I wish I knew what happened up in that Lincoln room when they talked for 3 hours, or when they wade in the surf for 3 more hours, and they discuss Disraeli and Melbourne, and they contemplate the fate of the world. That'd be the most fascinating story we could get. Let's see, somebody, yes. What do I think of the future of Taiwan? I don't think it's necessarily that bad. Again, I think these people are very patient. Our Asian experts in Hong Kong and Taiwan tell us, look, don't worry about this. He says, you Westerners, you Americans worry more about the Asians than the Asians do. That people over there adjust to new conditions. So my judgment, I guess, if I had to string it out, was that Taiwan may go on just as it is for decades yet, with absolutely no movement by Red China. That she may continue to progress, to grow strong, to grow wealthy, and that nothing will happen. And that we will honor our defense commitments. We will withdraw our troops, but we will still have our fleet over there. And I just think that maybe nothing, really, for a long while. And eventually, we'll see if Red China joins the world. Taiwan, when Chiang Kai-shek dies, his son apparently is not as opposed to a reunion there. I don't know. We'll just have to see. I think perhaps that's it's almost 9:30. I think perhaps that's a good note to end the evening on, and I thank you much. I'm glad to be here.
Again, our thanks to you, Hugh. It's a pleasure to have you back on the campus, believe me. We stand adjourned.
Yeah, man. Shut up.